Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Authors on the Air. I'm your host, James Latwell. And with us today, we've got Nick Kolakowski and Nick's new book, Where the Bones Lie. I mean, Nick, I think you did a fantastic job of it. This is, noir at its finest. I mean, you've really done a wonderful job.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on. I wanted, I mean, obviously, it makes my ear to hear you say that. My whole goal was to write a traditional detective thriller. It's just something I actually had never done before. A lot of my noir writing had been about heist masters and tough guys and all sorts of other assorted, unsavory characters. And then
Right.
one day I woke up, decided to tackle detectives. So I'm glad people resonating with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting a lot of buzz on social media. I'm seeing it everywhere. So I'm thinking this is going to have some legs to it. So, congrats to that, man.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. No, I hope
So,
I hope we build up a series. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah. I was going to ask about that, but yeah. Could you tell folks a little bit about the story behind this book?
Yeah. So the book is about a disgraced Hollywood fixer named Dash Fuller who is so traumatized by all the dirty deeds that he had to do for the big studios that he quits. And is tragically unsure of what to do with himself. So he tries all sorts of things like stand-up comedy and food delivery, and nothing's really working out, even if he is keeping a roof over his head. But then he meets a young woman named Madeline Ironwood, and Madeline's father had been this big time smuggler and criminal named Ken Ironwood. And Ken's bones have just been found in a body in a barrel in a little teeny tiny town, probably about 100 miles north of LA. And so Madeline's been trying and failing to get the cops or the FBI or anyone to be interested in the case. And obviously nobody is because, a homicide that's 30 years old is not really exciting your average police detective. So she convinces Dash to help her solve the crime. And when they get up there, they realize that the past is not dead. In fact, it's not even past. In fact, there's a lot of people out there who want to kill them in order to keep it nicely hidden. So that's the basic gist of the book.
Yeah, no, that's a great summary of it. Now, Dash is such a unique character, and you kind of mentioned it, as you were talking earlier about he's not the typical, noir protagonist that we seem that starts off in the gutter and just stays there through the book. I mean, there's some real character development that's gone on in Dash. I mean, he's seen everything, tries to get away from it, but gets sucked back in. I mean, how did that character come together for you, and where were the origins of his beginnings?
So I've always been fascinated with Hollywood fixers, and sort of the golden age of the fixer was back in the 1940s and the 1950s when the studios really did employ knee breakers and other types to settle the Hollywood business and make sure that the machine kept moving. I used to be an entertainment journalist for a very long time, which meant that I interviewed movie stars and music people and so on. And as part of that, you ran into a lot of people who their ostensible title was PR, but they pretty much operate. I mean, they weren't breaking kneecaps. This is kind of a slightly more refined version of those old characters, but they were still people who got things done and did
Right.
essentially whatever it took to make sure that everything kind of ran smoothly. And I pulled in a lot of stories from those people over the years, and always kind of had in the back of my head to write something that took place within that broader milieu of Hollywood and the entertainment industry and so on. And then, I mean, on top of that as well, I've always wanted to write a traditional detective story. I mean, it's something that I'd sort of been hesitant to tackle because I mean, it's the detective genre. There's so many great authors over the past 150 years who have done so many great books that, for me at least, to try to jump into those waters was extremely intimidating. But I figured that if I could take sort of this fascination and also some of my, like all the stories I'd heard personally and so on, and then package them up with a detective, that it would maybe present something that was kind of a little bit more of a unique spin than what you would find with a traditional detective narrative. And then on top of that, I mean, what you just said about the gutter is interesting because, I'm a lifelong diehard fan of all things noir and detective. And there's this
Yep.
trope that you see again and again where, the character is in the gutter. And oftentimes, like, they go from the gutter to the sewer or the gutter to just outright dead or whatever. You kind of, a lot of this genre is about watching the tail spin in a
Yeah.
certain way. And I wanted to do
Yeah.
a narrative where a character doesn't necessarily manage to completely recover from all of their various traumas and kind of change themselves as a person, but at least you can see by the end of the story how they're sort of in a better place psychologically and spiritually than they were before. I'm not. It's not. I don't want to position the book as like kumbaya, but I mean, I did want to do something that was a little bit more building up as opposed to watching somebody sort of be systematically dismantled, which is also fun. Don't get me wrong, I love those books, but I wanted to try something a little different for once.
which is also fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think if that was your intent, you nailed it because it. I mean, it reads like a gripping noir, mystery, but you don't see that trope, and this is kind of a refreshing, take on that. Is that there are so many levels of trauma, and you mentioned that Dash is going through, and Madeline to a degree,
Mhm.
and there's this shared kind of bond that they come up on. Um, was that kind of intentional? Because you're talking about grief and loss and how to move forward in life when everything looks bleak.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because as I was writing this book, I realized that most of the books I'd written, and I consciously didn't realize it until this point, are usually instead of having a singular protagonist, I usually have a duo, and usually the duos
Mm.
sort of bounce each other through. And in the case of this particular duo, Mash, call them Mash,
There you go.
Dash and Madeline, Mash, there we go. Um, in terms of this particular duo, they're both fractured in their own ways, but what I
Mhm.
was consciously trying to do with them was kind of create a pairing where their strengths complemented each other's weaknesses. They're very yin yang, and in that way, they both find a certain degree of closure. I mean, obviously, Madeline, because this is an investigation into her father's death, has a lot of lifelong trauma associated with that, and that comes out at moments with her in sort of outbursts or antisocial behavior. Like most of the time, I mean, she manages to keep it fairly buttoned up, but there's a few things, particularly when she's behind the wheel of a car,
Right.
where all of a sudden this stuff comes screaming out. Whereas Dash is having sort of seen the consequences of a lot of things in his life is much more cautious and he's much less devil may care than she is. So I mean that's sort of that combination of like fieriness and intellectualism and so on. I was trying to kind of make them play off, and in doing so, kind of maybe they both get to a place that they weren't able to get by themselves by the end. And again, I mean, it's nothing. It's not a sort of situation where I wanted to have them arrive at like a completely stable place because how many of us ever actually fully reach a fully stable place? But I wanted them to sort of exit better than they started, even if they do have, they're more physically battered up and so on. Trying desperately not to tiptoe into spoiler territory there.
Right. And yeah, without doing that, I mean, yeah, the pairing is really really well, and they do kind of complement each other. But one of the things I appreciate about your writing is it's very character oriented, character driven, and you really start investing in what's going to happen to Dash and his relationship with Madeline and where's that going, and um, you know these aren't secondary. She's not a secondary character. She's a supporting character in this story, and to a large degree, Manny is as well.
Mhm.
No spoilers here, but I mean, how do you plan out characters like, because the characters you have in the book, even if they appear in a scene, aren't throwaways. I mean, they're there
Mhm.
for a reason. So that's hard to manage. But how do you go about planning something like that?
So there's a couple of different theories of character development, but the one that I keep coming to again and again because it's also so simple, you can do it in two diagrams on a whiteboard, basically two circles. Andrew Kevin Walker, who's the guy who is the screenwriter for Seven,
Mm.
8 millimeter. Most recently, I think he was the main screenwriter on David Fincher's The Killer. Had this approach to character developing, which I really like because it's developed for screenplay writing. But in the case of secondary, it's so fast and it's so sharp in a certain way that in a novel context, you can apply to even secondary characters. And at least for me, it seems to work. And that is, you've got one character, or within each character you've got one impulse and then it's got a competing impulse to it. So you might have, let's say you have like a burned out cop, just throw another noir example in there, and that cop might have the urge to kind of keep going, to keep doing their job, to kind of try to keep fixing society's ills, but then they have this competing impulse where they want to sprint away from it. And in that dichotomy, if you can somehow figure out a way, and this is kind of the hard part, to get that dichotomy in the page somehow through action, through competing action, through kind of the obvious tensions that they're working through when they talk to people, then you sort of begin to generate almost sort of this under level, this sort of subconscious life to characters, even if it's a relatively short appearance. And so to varying degrees of success, I always try to do that. Like even minor characters where it's only 2 or 3 lines of dialogue, I try to think of those 2 points and then try to kind of balance out between them. Like what's driving them, not driving them,
Mhm.
or what's driving them away rather from the situation. The other piece of advice I really like was the writer's room for Mad Men had on their whiteboard apparently, and this is a much harder lesson to articulate, but I think in terms of designing even minor characters, I think if you can crack it, it's really amazing, just why so much stuff in that show is amazing, which is
Yeah.
character has a public life, they've got a private life, and then they've got a secret life. And I guess the trick with that is, that'll create incredibly layered characters, but you really have to plot out how you're going to move all that and how all those things are going to manifest in terms of what they say and do and so on. So I probably overthink all this, but this is just how I approach this sort of thing. Yeah.
No, that's an interesting discussion. I like that, and for folks that are out there listening to about character development, there's some real nuggets that were buried in there.
Mm.
Another thing that I liked about this book, Nick, was there's some great dark humor that's threaded through this book. I mean, and that's a hard balance to make when you're writing, a very serious, gritty, mystery, and then you have this dark thread of humor through it that was really a kick to read. How do you manage that?
I feel that you can't, as much as I like kind of darker material, you can't keep hitting that note on the keyboard over and over and over again because I mean, even
Yeah.
the audience it sort of wears them down. And sort of the fastest way to balance it out is with humor. I
Mm.
always treat I think this comes from my background as like a flash fiction writer and a short story writer, which is how I started out primarily, which is, especially when you're reading up in front of a live audience, which is also kind of how I began, a lot of noir at the bars and so on as I was refining my craft. You treat humor as sort of the punchline to something dark, and then that dichotomy of it really creates something interesting in the audience's mind. So you can have something terrible, and then if you punctuate it with somebody saying something funny or like some weirdly incongruous thing that happens to kind of drift into the frame at that moment, people really respond to that, and
Yeah.
it doesn't take away from the darkness or the grimness of whatever you're doing necessarily, but it also gives the audience a little bit of a breather so they can,
Mhm.
kind of keep going with you. Yeah, I mean, the humor bits for me are so precious in a certain way that even if I don't have like a fully fleshed story in mind, if I think of something that's kind of funny in a dark context, and I think it says something about my mind that I walk around thinking about this stuff like randomly anyway, I'll write it down in one of my notebooks anyway. So actually, I have sort of this reservoir of like, would it be funny if this happened? And then if
Oh,
I
wow.
can't immediately think of something humorous, like sometimes I'll go back and find something that fits. But I really do prize humor in a big way. I mean, I think it's essential. I think the other thing too is even when stuff is grim and dark, people are putting their money down or they're getting the book from the library because they want to be
Yeah.
entertained. They want a
Right.
sense of fun. So I think it's crucial for that as well.
No, and that did add another element to it that I thought really made the book just, that much better. So,
Mm,
well done, well done. One of the things that I noticed was the setting in this, Los Angeles in particular, seemed very well lived in,
mhm.
and very familiar. Now you're in New York now, right?
Correct.
Have you always been there, or had you lived in LA? Because this seems like an insider's guide to.
I've never lived full time in LA. When I was an entertainment writer, I was out in LA sometimes as long as like 2 or 3 weeks out of every month, and also broader
Mm.
California as well. And I still have family and friends who live in LA. So in this book, every place that they visit and every step that they go, when they go from LA up the coast past Santa Barbara to San Douglas, which is fictional, but it's a stand-in for Santa Ynez,
Okay.
is a place where I've physically been. Um,
Mm.
and that sort of dichotomy, and also when they go up into Hollywood Hills to Angie's or down to Santa Monica, Angie's house, and up in the hills and so on. And this sort of follows the same template that I follow in everything I've written in all my novels. I generally don't like writing about a place unless I've been there for a fairly significant length of time.
Yeah.
Just because then, yeah, you get that sort of that lived in feeling to it. And that's, it's potentially a little bit constraining, I guess, like unless you want to schedule a trip to go to some place and like actually trod the ground. But I just feel it's essential. So yeah, I spent a lot of time out there for a number of years, also in Vegas. I love it out there. I mean, I would definitely move in a second. I just don't happen to live there now.
Yeah. So, what's coming up next for you? You mentioned early on that there might be a sequel. We might see Dash again.
I hope so. I mean, it all comes down. I mean, in this business, it all comes down to how well things
Yep.
sell. So if it sells enough to warrant the sequel, and is my editor listening? Anyway, if it sells well enough to warrant the sequel, I actually have the outline already done. And in terms of like pulling from reality and so on, after I was an entertainment writer, because like the whole big glossy magazine business with celebrities on the cover, like that died at a certain point, and I shifted over to being a tech writer. So
Hmm.
after I spent a lot of time in Southern California, I then started spending a lot of time in Northern California in terms of San Francisco and Silicon Valley and San Jose and places like that. So the sequel would actually take them north into that whole environment up there, which I think there's
Okay.
also, I mean, everyone sort of has this stereotypical vision of Hollywood as this place of, kind of grimy evil underneath the shiny veneer. And in a certain way, they're not wrong. But I mean, Silicon Valley is also filled with sort of a different variation on the same theme. Like once you really dig into it, there's a lot of, if you're a crime writer, there's a lot of really rich seams in there. And so I'm really
Yeah,
excited to potentially explore that.
that'd be fun.
Yeah.
So we're gonna end up with something we call three quick hits. I want to put
Mhm,
you in
mhm.
Dash's headspace,
Okay,
and
cool.
I'll just ask you three questions.
Mhm.
What's Dash's favorite drink? What's its cocktail?
It used to be whiskey until he decided that he desperately needed to quit drinking. And now he's probably going for something relatively straightforward like a seltzer. He's not a real big energy drink or fruity drink kind of guy.
Yeah, that fits. How about his music? What does Dash listen to?
He's definitely somebody who tends to leave the Spotify playlist on random. And I say that because he's somebody who is usually so preoccupied with other things going on in his head that he just kind of wants almost like wallpaper or background music to listen to. And when he's feeling particularly down, particularly at some points in the book, he wants something that's actually more upbeat than you would expect from a noir hero, just because he's trying to like physically haul himself out of that mood. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, I see that. Let's take a right turn here. And what about Madeline? What would she listen to in her car while she's driving?
So as much as Madeline insists that she hates Taylor Swift and a lot of pop music, at one point in the novel, she's actually wearing a Taylor Swift t-shirt. And I thought in terms of the dichotomy, the push-pull that we were talking about earlier,
Right.
one of the early things I did when I was character building her was she was somebody who has that sort of hipster insistence on only listening to like, atonal dirge electronica, but in reality, she's inside the privacy of her car, she's like a huge pop monster. She's like a Taylor Swift person all the way.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And then finally, what's Dash's worst fear?
Dash fears so Dash is somebody who's very good at doing very bad things, and I think that he fundamentally fears being dragged into a situation where he has to kind of, no matter how good he is at it, he doesn't wanna do bad things anymore. He doesn't wanna be trapped in
Right.
his old modes. So I
Yeah,
think, yeah, that's other than death, that's probably his worst fear.
I love it. Folks, we've been talking with Nick Kolakowski, the author of Where the Bones Lie. Go out and get this one because we do want to see the sequel. So go out and do your thing, people, and go to the stores and order this one. Nick, this is a really good book. I think you've really got something going here.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on. This is real great. It's a lot of fun to get in Dash's and Madeline's headspace for a little bit.
And thanks for spending some time with us. Take
Of
care.
course. You too.